Inflation is a major issue in most developed economies at the moment, with some countries once renowned for their monetary stability experiencing double-digit annual price increases. It's also worth noting that these are just the headline figures, which, despite their purported purpose, don't take into account a sizable portion of the actual costs borne by real-life households. One could easily point to interest rates as a paradigmatic illustration of this. Given their dual nature, they are the primary tool central banks have to control inflation, but they also lead to higher interest payments for regular households at a time when everyone else's costs have risen by an average of 50% in the past 2 years. These are simply the developed economies of today. Certain developing economies are experiencing double-digit monthly inflation. But these outliers' problems can be traced to things like poor leadership and a reluctance to raise interest rates despite widespread efforts to do just that. I won't mention any names, but I will say that it's funny how Thanksgiving is right around the corner when interest rates should be raised in countries with persistently high inflation. However, prevention is always preferable to treatment. Looking at economies that aren't experiencing inflation may be the most fruitful way to figure out why ours keeps going up and up. Switzerland, certain European countries, and yes, even China, have much to teach us about the causes of inflation and the best strategies for preventing it. Unfortunately, it may be too late to apply these lessons to the United States economy right now. The question then arises as to why some countries around the world seem to be immune to inflation. Could we just copy what they're doing to solve the inflation problem, and how much did it set them back to become inflation-proof in the first place? When we've finished, Switzerland's economy will be at the top of every national list where economics is discussed. Most importantly, remember that inflation is the price increase of goods and services, and not the devaluation of currency. In some ways, it could be seen as just another angle on the same theme. However, this is a crucial point. This is crucial knowledge because even when everyone is using the same currency, inflation rates can vary from one region to the next. If we define inflation as the general rise in the prices of goods and services, then it becomes clear that inflation in one state, say California, can be significantly higher or lower than inflation in another state, say Michigan, at any given time, even though inflation is measured on a national level. And nations always use a single currency. To raise inflation, governments and central banks can increase total demand by pumping more money into the economy. There will be a rise in price because of the law of supply and demand. However, there are additional, regionally distinct causes of inflation. In Michigan, for instance, a particularly cold winter could increase demand for and the price of energy to keep homes warm, while in California, with its more temperate climate, homeowners wouldn't have to worry about the same issues and wouldn't see the same price increase. The Silicon Valley tech boom of the 2020s is a second real-world instance that could serve as an example. Because of the high concentration of well-paying jobs in the area, household demand is significantly higher than the national average in most major California cities. Many of you probably wouldn't believe official claims of 6 to 10% inflation in your home country, because the cost of living in your country has risen so much more quickly in recent years. Consumer price indexes track changes in prices for a wide range of goods and services meant to represent the purchasing habits of a typical urban family, so it's safe to assume that you're on target. Stocks and bonds, long heralded as the perfect complementary investments, have lost $36 trillion in masterworks due to inflation, making the situation even worse than the news has been reporting. This is because inflation acts like a black hole, devouring everything in its vicinity. The average 60/40 portfolio of these stocks and bonds, on which millions of people rely, has just had its worst year in a century, falling by 34%. One of the largest banks in the world, Morgan Stanley, may be able to save your drowning investment portfolio. They claim that if you invest in alternatives to gold and real estate, you can reduce risk and boost returns, but they don't specify which alternatives to invest in. As reported by CNBC, the world's affluent are increasingly looking to collectibles like fine art as a way to protect their wealth from inflation and as a more stable investment than the likes of stocks and cryptocurrency. It's no surprise that the city estimates the average amount spent on art this year could be double what it was a year ago. In 2022, the stock market had its worst year-to-date performance in half a century. Investors hoping to recoup past losses will be astounded by this change. Using Masterworks, how do you personally invest in art without spending millions? Unlike Masterworks allows investors to purchase multi-million-dollar works by artists such as Picasso, Basquiat, and Banksy. FTS, the value of this modern artwork has increased by 131% over the past 26 years, far outpacing the S&P 500. Our Masterworks portfolio has consistently produced positive returns through good times and bad for the past decade. A little over a week ago, they saw the painting and made a net profit of 17.5%. So far, in their last 3 sales, they have made over $17 and earned a net profit of 33%. Because of this extraordinary showing. Since users wanted more content, Masterworks purchased and uploaded additional artworks. They already have over 550,000 members, and newcomers must put their names on a waiting list. On the other hand, if you click the link provided in the description, you can bypass it entirely. Since these goods and services and markets in smaller economic centers normally suffer more during periods of high inflation, the cost of living for those who live outside of a major city or who have abnormal spending habits is likely to have risen more quickly than the headline figures suggest. Europe, with its many countries, most of which use the same currency, is a good example of a place where we can see this reflected in the numbers. €1 inflation in France was 6.2% last year, according to official data, which is significantly higher than the ECB's target inflation rate of 2% but lower than the inflation rate in Latvia, which was a whopping 22% last year despite using the same currency. Why, then, is inflation nearly 4 times as high in one country that uses the same currency as another? There are, of course, the glaring problems. Because of its proximity to Russia and Ukraine, Latvia is hit harder by problems in the rear. Latvia is physically closer to the cut-off Russian industrial centers than it is to the rest of the European Union. Therefore, it increased its trade with Russia and correspondingly incurred greater losses as a result of sanctions. Additionally, inflation is calculated in a different manner in France. The average Latvian family spends a much larger percentage of its income on food and energy than the average French family does because Latvia is a much poorer country than France. The weighting of the CPI in Latvia at the present time will therefore be higher for categories such as food and energy. Latvia's CP inflation rate is higher than average because of the country's reliance on the food and energy markets, 2 of the sectors most vulnerable to fluctuations in world prices. Inflation in France would be substantially higher if the CPI was calculated using Latvia's standards. Moreover, the inflation rate in Latvia would be considerably lower if the French Consumer Price Index were used as the standard. However, this in no way implies that the aforementioned calculations are inaccurate. As it turns out, we track inflation to learn more about the dynamics of a country's economy and populace. Therefore, it is crucial that the Consumer Price Index accurately reflects how people in that economy actually spend their money. The health of the Latvian economy shouldn't be judged by the demand for white flags and poodle haircuts if those aren't what most people in the country are spending their money on. Still, it's important to keep this in mind, as it means that comparing inflation rates directly isn't always the best idea, especially when comparing countries with vastly different socio-economic conditions. Aside from that caveat, though, France's inflation rate is lower than that of most other EU countries by almost any measure. Furthermore, you may have noticed that there is a European country on this list with an inflation rate that is significantly lower than even France's. Which begs the question, how is Switzerland succeeding? Because its citizens are among the world's wealthiest, Switzerland's economy is likely to be more resilient to inflation than that of countries with less affluent populations. This is because the wealthy are more likely to spend their money on non-essentials, such as travel, rather than on necessities, which they can forego if their cost rises. An excellent illustration of this is the relationship between inflation and the cost of eating out. At restaurants, higher-income families will spend more on dining out than lower-income families. But if inflation is very high, the wealthy families may opt to cook at home instead, reducing demand for restaurants and forcing them to lower their prices by holding promotions to win back fickle customers. Since low-income families probably weren't eating out much to begin with, they have no choice but to continue doing so. In addition, they can't stop buying the most basic necessities, such as food, because, well, they wouldn't be bare essentials if they didn't. So people will spend as much as they have to in order to provide for their families. However, the Swiss tale is not yet complete. The Swiss franc's relative stability compared to the US dollar is something that has been covered by many other media outlets. Dollar. It is one of the few places whose currency hasn't depreciated significantly so far this year. The Swiss franc's superiority is due in large part to the country's massive gold, financial asset, real estate, and government bond reserves. If the value of the Swiss franc rises too high, the central bank can sell assets in exchange for Swiss francs, and if the value of the Swiss franc falls too low, the central bank can sell Swiss francs in exchange for more assets. My viewers who are familiar with my videos on countries like China may recognize this as a currency peg, but Switzerland's approach is slightly different. Because they do not aim for a specific price. Typically, they let market forces set prices, but they have been known to step in when they see fit. This isn't completely wrong, but it leaves out some crucial information. Since inflation isn't the same thing as money losing value. Ironically, Switzerland is able to weather the global inflation storm because of its active trading economy. Trade, both inbound and outbound, is crucial to the Swiss economy. Trade intensity, in the context of economics, refers to the total value of all trade as a percentage of the size of an economy. Considering that Switzerland exports roughly the same amount of goods and services each year, its annual imports and exports total around $35,000 per Swiss citizen. The United States imports roughly $700 per person but exports only about $4,000. Global supply chains and trade tensions have all kinds of problems around the world. So it's not clear why international trade isn't one of the major contributing factors to inflation. However, as with many other things in economics, it's vital to avoid overgeneralizing lease. The European Union, EU, and the United Kingdom, UK, are major suppliers to Switzerland. Trains and trucks taking these routes won't be delayed by closed ports or traffic at distribution centers, so business can continue unabated. Because of their strong currency, Switzerland can now purchase these imports at a discount of 10% compared to a year ago. The impact of this change would be minimal in a country like the United States, where imports as a percentage of GDP is quite small. In spite of this, keep in mind that the average Swiss citizen imports $35,000 worth of goods every year. If they were to purchase these goods from Euro countries using their francs, they would be $3,500 better off for no other reason than their strong currency, which offsets a large part of any inflation they were subjected to. However, there is another side to this coin. Most of Switzerland's exports are high-end items with a significant value add that are less likely to be affected by widespread unrest. Aside from the fact that oil and gas are large-scale, low-margin commodities, the fact that the country relies primarily on hydroelectric power to power its economy makes it more resilient to fluctuations in those prices. There are many European countries that share this predicament. Do we have anything to gain from Switzerland? Not really, except perhaps for the potential returns on investments in high-value added sectors and renewable energy. In fact, historically, Switzerland has been fighting deflation, which has slowed growth in an otherwise very prosperous country. Keep in mind that low inflation is a common side effect of economic slowdowns. Many economies that aren't experiencing inflationary pressures right now are doing so because of Deeper economic issues that are stifling demand. Check out our videos explaining why China won't collapse and the situation in Japan. The goal here is to learn why deflation can be even more disastrous than inflation. This is an acceptable trade-off when all citizens enjoy a high standard of living, but it becomes more difficult when sustained growth could be the key to lifting millions of people out of poverty. These problems are less severe in Switzerland, but most economies will still have to forego significant growth to get into a position as stable as Switzerland's. And while I'm sure most economies would love to be Switzerland as much as I'd love to be a multimillionaire, it's not realistic to point to one of the wealthiest countries in the world and ask other countries why they can't just do what Switzerland is doing. Instead, we can learn from Switzerland's position on the economics explained nationally. As with any leaderboard, we'll start with size. Switzerland's GDP of $813 billion places it 20th in the world and earns a 7 out of 10. The GDP per capita is $93,457, which may not sound like much but is actually quite high. The United States of America, which is a highly productive nation, has a GDP per capita of only $69,288. The highly technical industries in which Swiss citizens are employed are largely responsible for this staggering number. Many times on this channel I have cited the Swiss as the best at taking raw steel and turning it into a finished product, a wristwatch. We give it a perfect score of 10. In addition, they have exceptional still dance skills and self-assurance. Although it no longer provides banking services to the global elite, its reputation for impartiality and stability has ensured that it remains the location of choice for honest financial transactions. Even though the country's growth has been strong in comparison to its European neighbors, it hasn't exactly set the bar extremely high. This could be because the country's cautious governing system encourages slow, stable growth, which the country has been experiencing. A 7 out of 10 is assigned to it. Last but not least, while industry is limited, the sectors in which they excel are global leaders. A Swiss banker is your best bet for a successful financial transaction. Swiss watches and chocolate are both considered to be among the best in the world. Overall, Switzerland's manufacturing sector is rated an 8. This puts Switzerland's economy in third place on the leaderboard, with an average score of 8.4 out of 10. A big hat tip to you for tuning in, bro. Bye.